It was 1986, and from the armored cockpit of his Mi-24 Hind, Senior Lieutenant Valery Orlov felt like a god. His machine, the Crocodile, was not merely a helicopter, it was a flying tank, a 10-ton monster of riveted steel and weapon pylons. Below him, the rocky valleys were a map of dust and stone, a primitive world his machine was designed to tame. His orders were simple: provide overwatch for a motorized column moving through a known insurgent travel path. For Valery, this was routine. It was pest control. His wingman, flying a staggered formation 200 meters to his right, was a new pilot, fresh from the academy. Valery smiled grimly. The boy would learn, as he had, that the Mujahideen were ants. They had rifles. They had courage. Yes, but courage was useless against 12.7mm rotary cannons and unguided 57mm rockets. The Soviet 40th Army owned the sky. This was the fundamental truth of the Afghan war. The ground belonged to whomever could hold it for a day. The sky belonged to the Red Banner Air Force, always. Valery keyed his throat mic. Viper 2, maintain spread. Watch the ridge to your east. I see. Potential movement. Dust. Copy, Viper 1. The young pilot's voice crackled back, tight with nerves. Valery scanned the ridge. Nothing. Just rocks. He had spent 400 combat hours in this country. He could smell a trap. But this felt empty. The column was moving well. This would be an easy day. He banked his heavy machine. The rotors beating the air into submission, thud, 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 a sound that, to the men on the ground, was the voice of judgment. Then the impossible happened. It was not an explosion. It was a deletion. One moment, Viper 2 was there, a dark green shark against the pale brown mountains. The next, it was a rapidly expanding fireball of atomized metal and kerosene. There was no smoke trail. There was no pop of an anti-aircraft gun. There was no red-green tracer fire arcing up from the ground. There was only silence on the radio, and then a sudden, violent flash of white-hot magnesium that was brighter than the Sunday. The Hind didn't fall. It disintegrated. The main rotor hub, a piece of metal weighing nearly a ton, separated from the airframe and simply climbed 1,000 feet into the air, propelled by its own momentum, before tumbling back to Earth. Valery screamed into his mic, Vivica 2! Viper 2, talk to me! Silence. He wrenched his hind into a tight, panicked circle, his eyes scanning the ground. Who fired? Where did they fire from? He saw nothing. No men. No vehicles. No large, tripod-mounted Zu-23 cannon. Nothing. Just dust. He was alone. The sky, which seconds before had been his kingdom, was now the most terrifying place in the world. He turned his machine and fled back toward Bagram, the sound of his own rotors suddenly feeling fragile, vulnerable. The debrief was a nightmare. The political officer, the Zampolit, slammed his fist on the table. Mechanical failure, he spat. You saw it burn. I saw an explosion, Comrade Major, Valery said, his voice shaking. But I did not see an attack. There was nothing. Nothing? The Major's voice was ice. A brand new Mi-24, the pride of our Air Force, does not simply explode for nothing. Was it pilot error? Did he fly into the ground? No. We were at 500 meters. Clear air. He was just gone. The report was filed. Lost to unknown catastrophic mechanical failure. But everyone on the base knew that was a lie. The whispers started. A new weapon. A ghost. This incident, isolated and terrifying, was only the beginning. It was the first drop of rain in a storm that would drown the Soviet war effort. If you're fascinated by the hidden stories and technological shocks of the Cold War, consider subscribing to Cold War Impact. We dig deep into the mysteries that defined the modern world. Within weeks, the phenomenon spread. It was no longer just the Hinds. And Su-25 Frogfoot, the Soviet equivalent of the American 8-ton Warthog, was on a high-speed bombing run near Kandahar. The Frogfoot was a flying bathtub, its pilot encased in a titanium shell designed to stop cannon fire. It was arguably the most survivable ground attack jet on Earth. The pilot, a veteran of 2 tours, radioed his control tower. Engaging target, rockets away. His voice was calm. Minutes later, the tower heard another transmission. It was not calm. It was a single, choked word. Ejecting. The pilot was found 3 days later, wandering the desert, dehydrated and in shock. His story was incoherent. He had been lining up his second pass. He heard a thump from the rear of his aircraft. He thought his engine had flamed out. Then every warning light in his cockpit lit up at once. Fire, hydraulic failure, total electrical loss. He pulled the handle. He never saw what hit him. Now, the Kremlin was listening. A high-level commission was dispatched from Moscow. This was no longer a mechanical failure. This was enemy action. But what action? The investigation began, and it was a scramble into pure confusion. The first theory was a new, captured, heavy anti-aircraft system. The CIA was known to be supplying the Mujahideen. Had they given them Swiss Oerlikon cannons? British rapiers? These were large, complex, radar-guided systems. They required trucks, generators, and trained crews. Soviet Spetsnaz teams were sent on brutal, bloody search-and-destroy missions. They scoured the valleys, raided villages, and tortured prisoners. They found thousands of rifles. They found caches of ancient bolt-action Enfields, Chinese-made RPGs, and a few precious D-K heavy machine guns. They found nothing capable of swatting a high-speed jet or an armored hind out of the sky from 2 kilometers away. The confusion festered and turned into a dark, corrosive paranoia. Pilots began to report ghost signals on their radar warning receivers, even though their equipment was designed to detect radar, and this new threat was clearly not using it. They reported streaks of light in the corners of their vision, streaks that vanished when they looked directly at them. The Mujahideen, who had once run and hidden from the sound of rotors, now seemed to stand their ground, waiting. The Soviet High Command was terrified. This phantom was not just a weapon, it was a strategic dagger. The entire Soviet doctrine in Afghanistan was built on the principle of vertical envelopment, using helicopters to land troops behind enemy lines, to resupply cut-off garrisons, and to provide devastating, on-call fire support. The Mi-24 Hind and the Mi-8 transport were the legs, the arms, and the fists of the 40th Army. This new threat didn't just challenge that doctrine, it severed its head. If the helicopters could be killed, and killed so easily, so invisibly, then the war was unwinnable. The cost of fuel was already bleeding the Soviet economy. The cost in aircraft was unsustainable. But the cost in psychology, that was the worst. Soviet planners based in Moscow grew frantic. They pored over reconnaissance photos. They analyzed wreckage. The pieces of Viper 2, or what was left of them, told a strange story. The metal was not punctured by bullets. It was shredded, as if a bomb had gone off inside the engine housing. The heat of the explosion had been so intense, it had melted the turbine blades. This was not a cannon shell. This was something new. Their analysts developed theories. Was it a new form of remotely detonated mine, somehow placed on a mountain ridge and aimed at the sky? Impossible. Was it a directed energy weapon, a laser, that American intelligence was rumored to be testing? Science fiction. Was it a team of highly trained British SAS or American Delta Force operators hiding in the mountains with an advanced, secret weapon system? This last theory was the most plausible and the most terrifying. It meant NATO was directly intervening. But even this didn't make sense. The attacks were too widespread. They were happening in the Panjshir. Then a day later in Kandahar, 500 kilometers to the south, the ghost was everywhere. It was a single-point failure that threatened the entire Soviet system. Their multi-billion ruble air force, the product of decades of engineering, was being neutralized. But by what? They had to find an answer, and they had to find it before they lost the sky itself. The Kremlin's response was immediate and thunderous. The failure in Afghanistan was no longer just a military quagmire, it was a technological humiliation. A special commission was formed, a troika of grim-faced men from the GRU Main Intelligence Directorate, the KGB's first Chief Directorate, and the VVS, the Soviet Air Force's Scientific Institute. Their one-word directive: Uznat, find out. The investigation began not in the mountains of Afghanistan, but in the sterile, fluorescent-lit laboratories of the VVS headquarters in Moscow. The scramble was on. Every piece of wreckage, every scrap of shrapnel was meticulously collected by Spetsnaz teams often under fire and flown back to the Soviet Union in lead-lined boxes, as if they were radioactive. Engineers in white coats laid the fragments out on massive tables, trying to piece together the ghost. The first clue was the damage. It was precise. The warheads were not large. This was not a 1,000-pound bomb. The explosions were consistently detonating at the single hottest point of the aircraft, the engine exhaust nozzle. On the Hinds, it was the turbine exhaust. On the Su-25s, it was the jet pipe. The fragments were small, sharp, and numerous, designed to shred, not to blast. The second clue was chemical. The residue on the melted turbine blades was not from standard Soviet propellant. It was a proprietary, high-energy American chemical blend. The third and most damning clue came from the few seeker heads that were recovered partially intact. They were infrared, heat-seeking. "So," declared a senior GRU colonel, slapping a file on the table, "it is settled. The Americans are giving the bandits the red eye." There was a collective sigh of relief in the room. The FIM-43 red eye was a known quantity. It was a first-generation, man-portable, shoulder-fired missile. The Soviet Union had its own equivalent, the 9K-32 Strela II, known to NATO as the Grail. Both weapons were, to be blunt, garbage. These first-generation missiles had a fundamental flaw. Their infrared seekers were primitive. They were sensitive only to the most intense heat sources. This meant they could only lock onto the blazing hot exhaust nozzle of a jet engine, and only from the rear. It was a tail-chase weapon. If a pilot saw the missile's smoke trail, he could simply turn. The missile's seeker would lose its lock, unable to distinguish the engine from the sun or the warm ground. Furthermore, a simple flare, a bright magnesium charge, would easily decoy it. Soviet pilots were already trained for this. The doctrine was simple: fly low, fly fast, and pop flares when exiting a target area. The red eye was a nuisance, not a game-changer. The Commission sent its preliminary report. The threat is the FIM-43 red eye. The countermeasure is increased flare deployment and revised tail-chase evasion tactics. For 1 week, there was calm. Then the real reports began to flood in. A squadron leader near Jalalabad, his voice high with panic, radioed Bagram Air Base. "I am hit! I am hit! It came from the front!" The wreck of his Su-25 was found. The missile had entered his intake. It had not locked on his exhaust. It had locked on the faint heat of his turbine blades, through the front of the engine. Another Hind pilot, this one on a high-altitude patrol, reported being ambushed by the Sunday. A missile had come down from above, diving on him. It had locked on the sunlight, glinting off his rotor hub. The wrong conclusions evaporated, replaced by a cold, sickening dread. This was not a red eye. This was not a tail-chase weapon. This was an all-aspect missile. It could be fired from any angle, front, side, above, below. It was not locking on the exhaust, it was locking on the airframe itself. Its seeker was so sensitive it could distinguish the heat of air friction on the leading edge of a wing from the cooler background of the sky. The pilot's anecdotes, once dismissed as hysteria, were now treated as gospel. The ghost was taking shape. They described a thin, grey pencil of smoke that seemed to rise lazily from a mountainside, almost too slow to be a threat. Then, this pencil would make an impossible high G-turn and accelerate to Mach 2. There was no time to react. The missile was faster than the flares. And it was smart. Pilots reported dropping entire banks of flares, turning their aircraft into a Christmas tree of false heat signatures. The missile ignored them. It had a countermeasure. The engineers in Moscow were baffled. How could a man-portable missile, no bigger than a rocket-propelled grenade, contain a seeker sophisticated enough to distinguish between the infrared signature of a magnesium flare and the specific, multi-band signature of a Soviet turboshaft engine? The bogeyman was born. The pilots, with grim, fatalistic humor, began calling it the Stinger, a name they had heard in Mujahideen radio intercepts. The name stuck. It was a creature. It lived in the rocks. It was invisible. It was invincible. And it was hunting them. The paranoia crippled the Air Force. Pilots, once predators, became prey. They began to fly at night, hoping the missile's seeker was only visual. It wasn't. It was infrared. It owned the night. They tried to fly higher, pushing their helicopters to their absolute service ceiling, above 5,000 meters, where the air was thin and the Mujahideen were just specks. The Stinger could climb. It met them there. The Soviet response was frantic, primitive, and desperate. They welded extra steel plates to their helicopters. It did nothing. They told their pilots to not fly, to ground the entire fleet. The 40th Army's logistics chain collapsed within days. Garrisons began to starve. The aircraft were forced back into the sky, and the Stinger was waiting. The investigation in Moscow had hit a wall. They had moved from "it's a red-eye" to "it is a weapon that violates our understanding of physics." They had no data on this Stinger. They had no schematics. They had no counter. The Soviet Union, a superpower with the largest military on Earth, was being brought to its knees by a weapon that, according to their own intelligence, did not exist. They had to get one. Not a fragment. Not a seeker head. They needed a whole, intact, unfired missile. The word went out to every GRU agent and Spetsnaz captain in Afghanistan. A bonus of 100,000 rubles, and the Order of the Red Banner to the man who brings one back. The hunt was no longer for answers. It was for a miracle. They were hunting a ghost, and the ghost was winning. While the GRU hunted for a superweapon and Soviet pilots invented bogeymen in the high-altitude glare, the truth was not hiding in a fortified Area 51 or a futuristic lab. It was sitting in plain wooden crates in a dusty CIA warehouse in Pakistan. The source of the Kremlin's existential terror was a 9-year-old American defense program that had almost been cancelled. The story of the ghost did not begin in Afghanistan. It began in the 1960s with the abject failure of the FIM-43 Red-Eye. American planners, just like their Soviet counterparts, had seen the future of warfare: low-flying, high-speed attack jets and armoured helicopter gunships. The Red-Eye, their first attempt at a man-portable air defense system, or MANPADS, was a disaster. It was a tail-chase-only weapon. Its uncooled seeker was, in battlefield terms, nearly blind. It was easily fooled by the sun, by a hot rock, or by a single cheap flare. In Vietnam, it had achieved almost nothing. The US Army knew it had a problem. It needed a fire-and-forget weapon that a single soldier could carry. It needed a missile that could hit a jet from any angle, not just from behind. It needed a missile smart enough to ignore countermeasures. In 1971, the Army issued a requirement that, to the rest of the world, sounded like science fiction. They didn't just want a new missile, they wanted a revolution. The contract was given to General Dynamics. The project was codenamed Stinger. The challenge was not to make a missile that could fly fast. That was easy. The challenge was to solve 3 impossible problems in a tube that weighed only 34 pounds. The first impossible problem was the seeker. To hit a jet from the front, the missile couldn't look for the exhaust. It had to see the faint heat generated by air friction on the wings or the warm shimmer of the engine's intake. The old Red-Eye's lead sulfide seeker was, charitably, a candle in a hurricane. It was useless. The engineers at General Dynamics turned to a material called indium antimonide. This material was spectacularly sensitive to infrared radiation, but it had a catch. It only worked if it was cryogenically frozen. The team's solution was ingenious. They inserted a tiny, disposable canister of high-pressure argon gas. When the gunner pulled the trigger, this argon was released, and the rapidly expanding gas, a process known as the Joule-Thomson effect, flash-froze the seeker's sensor to a temperature of -196 degrees Celsius in seconds. The result was an eye, so sensitive it could see the battlefield in thermal color. It didn't just see a hot dot, it saw a complex, multi-band signature. This was the source of the all-aspect capability that so terrified the Soviet pilots. The missile could lock onto the hot intake of an Su-25 from the front, or the glint of sunlight off a Heinz rotor hub from above. To the Soviets, this was black magic. To the Americans, it was just thermodynamics. The second impossible problem was the brain. This was the true secret of American dominance. The Soviet Strela II was a dumbfire weapon. It saw heat. It flew at heat. The Stinger was intelligent. For the first time, engineers managed to fit a fully functional digital microprocessor into a shoulder-fired missile. This microprocessor didn't just see the target, it analyzed it. The seeker's eye used a rosette scan pattern, a spinning, flower-like petal pattern that sampled the target 600 times a second. It built a detailed two-dimensional thermal image. The microprocessor then locked onto this image, not just a point of heat. This was the key that unlocked the third impossible problem: countermeasures. When a Soviet pilot popped his flares, the Strela II was easily fooled. It saw a new, brighter heat source and veered off. The Stinger's processor was not so simple. When a flare bloomed, the processor analyzed it. It saw a new, bright, round object that was rapidly cooling and falling away from the target's original flight path. The processor would then make a decision. That is a decoy. I will ignore it. My original target, shaped like a jet and still on its original vector, is still my target. The missile had a logic. It had a brain. It could not be fooled. This was the technological leap that the Soviet Union, with its centralized, imitation-based economy, could not comprehend. American ingenuity was not just about building bigger rockets or larger tanks. It was about the microchip. It was about the Silicon Revolution that was happening in small garages in California. The Stinger was not just a missile, it was a 34-pound flying computer. The program was slow. It was expensive. It entered full-rate production in 1981. For years, these incredible weapons sat in armories in West Germany, waiting for a war with Soviet tanks that never came. Then, in 1985, the calculus in Washington changed. The war in Afghanistan was a bloody stalemate, a leverage point in the Cold War, but the Soviet control of the sky was total. A small vocal group of US congressmen, led by Charlie Wilson, began a ferocious, clandestine lobbying campaign. Give the Mujahideen a weapon that can actually work. Give them the Stinger. The CIA was terrified. This was their most advanced, non-nuclear, man-portable technology. If one fell into Soviet hands, it would be a catastrophic intelligence loss. The program was classified top secret, but the political pressure was immense. In late 1985, President Ronald Reagan signed the secret National Security Decision Directive 166. The initial shipment was small, just 300 missiles. A team of CIA paramilitary officers from the Special Activities Division, along with US Army Green Berets, were sent to Pakistan. They ran a crash course. They found the most reliable, least fundamentalist Mujahideen commanders. They taught them the basics. This is the trigger. This is the sight. Point it at the Soviet aircraft. The eye in the sight will start to sing. That is the identification friend, or foe system. Don't worry about it. Just wait for the warble. That warble is the sound of the seeker locking. Pull the trigger and run. The CIA trainers were skeptical. They were giving a $6,000 piece of futuristic technology to men who, in many cases, were illiterate. They had no idea what was about to happen. In September 1986, a group of 35 Mujahideen, led by an engineer named Ghaffar, slipped into the mountains north of Kabul. They carried with them 3 of the first Stinger missile launchers. They set up an ambush near the Bagram airbase. They waited. They didn't have to wait long. On the 25th of September, 1986, engineer Ghaffar and his small team lay perfectly still on a dusty ridge, overlooking the approach path to Jalalabad airfield. They had been there for 2 days, living on stale bread and water. They were not aiming for Bagram, as the CIA had suggested. They were aiming for a softer, secondary target, a place where the helicopters flew low and slow. Ghaffar himself, one of the few Mujahideen who could read, had studied the American-made instruction manual until his eyes burned. He was not just a fighter, he was a technician about to conduct a field test. At approximately 3 p.m. he heard it, the familiar, dreaded thud-thud-thud of Soviet air power. Coming in low from the south were 3 Mi-24 Hinds, flying in a lazy, arrogant echelon. They were returning from a mission, their weapon pylons empty, their crews thinking of hot food and rest. They were flying at 400 feet, confident in their invincibility. Ghaffar raised the 15-pound green launch tube to his shoulder. He looked through the simple optical sight. A small eye was visible. He uncaged the seeker head. The argon gas canister hissed, flash freezing the indium antimonide sensor. Suddenly, his earpiece, a simple wire, came alive with a low, steady growl. The missile could see the helicopters. He centered the lead hind in his sight. The growl sharpened into a high-pitched, insistent warble, the sound of a perfect, unshakable lock. "Allahu Akbar," he whispered, and squeezed the trigger. There was a loud pop and a cloud of smoke as the small launch motor ejected the missile from the tube, pushing it a safe 10 meters from Ghaffar before the main 2-stage rocket motor ignited. The missile, a thin white pencil, leaped into the sky. In the lead hind, Senior Lieutenant Valery Orlov, the same pilot who had seen his wingman vanish months earlier, was not even on high alert. His warning receiver was silent. There was no radar lock. He was just flying. His co-pilot was the first to see it. "What is—" The Stinger, traveling at over 1,500 miles per hour, didn't hit the engine. It hit the tail boom. The warhead's 3-kilogram charge of high explosives and fragmentation detonated, and the hind's tail simply ceased to exist. The heavy main fuselage, now completely out of control, pitched forward and began to spin violently. It cartwheeled into the ground at over 100 knots, exploding in a fireball that climbed 1,000 feet. Gaffer had already shouldered a second launcher. He aimed for the second hind, which was now braking hard, its pilot screaming into the radio. "Warble." He fired again. This missile punched straight through the main cabin, detonating inside the troop bay. A third hind, its pilot finally understanding the nightmare, dropped a cloud of flares and dived for the ground. Gaffar's third missile ignored the flares completely and slammed into its main rotor hub. In less than 60 seconds, 3 of the most feared weapons in the Soviet arsenal, machines worth millions of rubles, had been swatted from the sky by 3 missiles. The Ghost now had a kill count. This was the confrontation. The shock moment was not this single event, but the tidal wave that followed. Within 2 weeks, the Stinger was everywhere. The Jalalabad ambush was repeated, then repeated again. At Bagram, at Kandahar, at Shindand. Soviet aircraft losses went from a painful but manageable 2 or 3 per month to 3 or 4 per day. The Soviet pilots were in a state of mass, collective panic. Their radio frequencies were a constant stream of terror. "I am hit! Stinger! Stinger! Flares not working! Flares not working! Ejecting! Ejecting!" The Soviet High Command was in disbelief. Their multi-billion ruble air force was being systematically annihilated. The horrifying truth that had been whispered by paranoid pilots was now a verifiable daily fact, written in burning wreckage across every major province. The bogeyman was real, and it was waging a one-sided war of extermination. The Kremlin's response was no longer an investigation. It was a desperate, panicked countermeasure surge. The first order was tactical. All helicopters were forbidden from flying below 10,000 feet. This, the generals reasoned, would put them above the missile's effective ceiling. But this tactical shift was a strategic catastrophe. A hind at 10,000 feet is useless. It cannot see targets. It cannot provide close air support. It cannot land troops. It became nothing more than a very loud, very expensive observation balloon. The Soviet doctrine of vertical envelopment was dead. The second response was technical. Teams of engineers worked around the clock, bolting massive heavy infrared jammers onto the hinds. These devices, nicknamed Linden by NATO, were giant hot plates designed to radiate more heat than the engine, theoretically confusing the missile seeker. At the same time, new automated flare dispensers were installed on every aircraft, programmed to fire in complex rhythmic salvos. It was a futile effort. The Linden jammers were worse than useless. The Stinger's microprocessor, with its rosette scan, saw the jammer for exactly what it was: a large, static, rectangular heat source that was not the engine. It ignored it. The new flare patterns were equally pointless. The missile's brain, analyzing the battlefield at 600 times per second, saw the flares ignite and fall away. It registered them as decoys and stayed locked on the original airplane-shaped thermal image of the target. Finally, in a move of pure desperation, the Soviets deployed their newest, most advanced air superiority fighter to Afghanistan, the MiG-29 Fulcrum. These were not ground attack jets. They were top-of-the-line dogfighters designed to fight American F-16s over Europe. Their mission now? To fly high-altitude hunter-killer patrols for Mujahideen walking in the mountains. It was the strategic equivalent of using a battleship to hunt a single shark. It was a ruinously expensive admission of defeat. The GRU finally did get its missile. In 1987, a Spetsnaz team, acting on a tip, ambushed a Mujahideen team and recovered 2 intact Stinger launchers and several missiles. They were flown to Moscow and torn apart. What the Soviet engineers found horrified them more than the losses. They found the microprocessor. They saw the indium antimonide seeker. They saw the rosette scan pattern. And they realized in that moment that they could not possibly replicate this. They were decades behind. This wasn't a weapon. It was a message. It was a symptom of a deeper systemic rot. The American Ghost was not just a missile. It was a tiny, flying 34-pound computer, and it had rendered their entire air force obsolete. The final verdict of the Stinger's impact was not written in a single report, but in the flight logs of the Soviet Air Force. The numbers, when they were finally declassified, told a story more chilling than any pilot's anecdote. The killer statistic is a matter of debate, but the most conservative, CIA-verified figures are staggering. Out of approximately 340 Stinger missiles fired by the Mujahideen during the peak of the conflict, they achieved 269 confirmed kills. That is a kill probability of nearly 80%. For a first-generation, man-portable weapon system deployed by non-uniformed, semi-trained irregulars in one of the most hostile environments on Earth, this number is not just high, it is unprecedented. It is a statistic that has no parallel in the history of modern warfare. Before the Stinger's introduction in September 1986, the Soviet 40th Army was losing, on average, 1 aircraft every 3 days. After September 1986, they began losing 1 aircraft every day. The skies over Afghanistan were, in effect, closed. The war's most critical asset, the helicopter, was now a multi-million ruble death trap. The sound of thud, thud, thud was no longer the sound of Soviet power. It was the sound of a target. But the Stinger's true impact was not on the battlefield. It was on the system. This one weapon exposed the terminal, systemic failure of the entire Soviet project. The Cold War was, at its heart, an economic and industrial contest. The Soviet Union had built its empire on a foundation of brute force and massive industrial production. They could build more tanks. They could build more artillery. They could build heavier, more armored helicopters. Their system was designed for imitation and mass production. It could copy a B-29 bomber. It could steal nuclear secrets. It was a monolith of steel, concrete, and centralized 5-year plans. The Stinger was a product of a completely different world. It was not a weapon of steel, it was a weapon of silicon. Its power was not in its explosive charge, but in its microprocessor. Its genius was not in its rocket motor, but in its software. It was a child of the American system of decentralized innovation, of venture capital, of a consumer electronics boom that was creating microchips for video games and home computers. The Soviet Union, with its rigid, top-down bureaucracy, could not compete in this new arena. While Soviet engineers were still struggling to reliably manufacture basic transistors, American engineers were programming logic into a 34-pound fire-and-forget weapon. The Soviet engineers who tore the captured Stinger apart in 1987 were, in that moment, the morticians of their own empire. They were looking at a future they had no part in. They could not copy it, they could not counter it, and they knew it. This technological gap was a chasm that could not be bridged. The failure in Afghanistan, accelerated and finalized by the Stinger, was not just a military defeat, it was an economic one. The war was bankrupting an already teetering economy. The ghost that Valery Orlov saw in the Panjshir Valley was, in retrospect, the ghost of the Soviet Union itself. The legacy of that impossible event is the legacy of the late Cold War. It was a war ultimately won not by the number of nuclear warheads, but by the speed of a microchip. The bogeyman that the Soviet pilots saw in the rocks and the sun was the horrifying realization that their entire conception of power was obsolete. They were analog warriors in a digital world. The Stinger was a 34-pound, 21st century spear, and it was aimed directly at the heart of their 19th century empire. The mystery that began with a flash of light over the Panjshir Valley ended with the collapse of a superpower that was, in the end, haunted and hunted into extinction by a technology it could neither comprehend nor defeat. The air inside the Tupolev Tu-95 was a stale mix of recycled oxygen, sweat, and the faint, acrid smell of hot electronics. Outside the thick cockpit glass, the sky over the Norwegian Sea was a canvas of infinite, unforgiving grey. It was September 1971. For Senior Lieutenant Alexei Voronov, the navigator of this lumbering beast nicknamed the Bear by the very enemies he was tracking, this was the 4th consecutive day of the same monotonous, draining reality. His mission: to shadow the American aircraft carrier USS John F. Kennedy and its entire battle group. His orders were simple: watch, record, report. Stay just outside the effective range of their F-4 Phantom interceptors and be the ever-present eyes of the Soviet Northern Fleet. On the first day, the American task force had been a spectacle of raw power, cutting through the slate-grey water with arrogant speed. By the 4th day, Alexei and his crew expected to see a different picture. They knew the laws of physics. They knew the brutal calculus of naval warfare. A fleet, no matter how powerful, is a creature tethered to land by an invisible leash of logistics. Every high-speed maneuver, Every catapult launch, every hour spent on combat air patrol burned thousands of gallons of fuel. Every sortie expended ordnance. Every sailor consumed food and water. By now, the American fleet should be showing signs of fatigue. It should be conserving fuel, reducing its speed, preparing for the long, slow journey back to its base in Norfolk or Holy Loch. This was the Soviet doctrine, the cornerstone of their naval strategy. The enemy's logistical chain was his greatest vulnerability. You didn't need to sink the carrier if you could simply wait for it to starve. From his station, Alexei's radar operator announced the familiar contacts. Bearing 075, range 100 kilometers, task force holding steady at 20 knots. 20 knots, not the slow crawl of a fleet conserving its lifeblood, but a confident, operational pace. It made no sense. Alexei's flight engineer had run the numbers a dozen times. Based on their observed activity, the American destroyers and cruisers escorting the carrier should be running on fumes. The carrier itself, a floating city with an insatiable appetite for jet fuel and black oil, should be critically low. Yet, it steamed on as if it had just left port. The confidence was baffling. It was insulting. Then, a new contact appeared on the radar screen. It was large, moving at the same speed as the battle group, but it wasn't a warship. Its radar signature was broad, clumsy. A merchant vessel? Here, it was positioning itself to the port side of the massive carrier. On the radio, the crew's chatter turned from bored professionalism to curious speculation. Were they witnessing a rendezvous with a civilian oil tanker? A desperate, reckless move? The Bear's commander, a grim veteran of the Cuban Missile Crisis, banked the heavy bomber, bringing them to the very edge of the safe zone for a better look through the powerful optical cameras mounted in the fuselage. The image that resolved on the tactical screen stole the breath from every man in the aircraft. It was not some clumsy civilian tanker. It was a massive, grey-painted ship, the USS Sacramento. But it was what was happening between the Sacramento and the John F. Kennedy that shattered every tactical assumption held by the Soviet Navy. Heavy cables, like steel spiderwebs, stretched between the two ships as they sailed in perfect, synchronized formation at over 15 knots. Pallets of ammunition, stacked high with bombs and missiles, glided across the wires as if weightless. Simultaneously, thick black hoses, suspended from massive rigs, snaked across the churning water, pumping thousands of gallons of fuel from one vessel to the other. And swarming between the decks of the replenishment ship and the carrier's escorts were heavy-lift helicopters, their rotors whipping the sea spray into a frenzy as they ferried nets loaded with supplies, mail, and even personnel. It wasn't a resupply. It was a symphony of logistics, a perfectly choreographed ballet of steel and fuel performed on a churning ocean stage in the middle of nowhere. They weren't just refueling one ship. They were rearming and replenishing the entire battle group, all at once, without ever slowing down. Alexei stared, his mind struggling to process the implications. The invisible leash he had been taught to believe in did not exist. For the Americans, the ocean was not a barrier. It was a highway. Their fleets did not need to go home. Home came to them. The dot on the radar wasn't just another ship. It was a phantom, a ghost from a world of limitless capability that defied all of their rules. In that moment, a cold dread, far more chilling than the Arctic air outside, settled deep in Alexei's gut. Their entire understanding of naval warfare was wrong. The image of that impossible mid-ocean replenishment became a symbol of a strategic gap that haunted Soviet planners for decades. It was a physical manifestation of American dominance that was as potent as any new missile or aircraft. We're going to explore how this incredible logistical power worked, why the Soviets could never hope to match it, and how this unglamorous, often overlooked capability shaped the outcome of the Cold War. To see more stories about the hidden forces and technological shocks that defined this era, make sure to subscribe to Cold War Impact. To understand the depth of the Soviet shock, one must first understand the mind of the Soviet Navy. Forged in the crucible of the Second World War's brutal land campaigns, the Soviet military was a continental power. Its thinking was dominated by the army by tanks, artillery, and vast land armies. The Navy was, for a long time, an afterthought, a coastal defense force designed to protect the flanks of the Red Army. Its operational horizon was limited to the Baltic, the Black Sea, and the immediate coastal waters of the motherland. Their ships were potent, often bristling with enormous anti-ship missiles, but they were, in naval parlance, short-legged. They were designed for quick, decisive sprints from port, powerful strikes against enemy convoys or fleets approaching the coast, and a swift return to the safety of their heavily defended bases. This doctrine was solidified and expanded under the formidable admiral of the fleet of the Soviet Union, Sergei Gorshkov. Gorshkov was a visionary, and he fought tirelessly to transform the Soviet fleet into a true blue-water navy. He understood that to be a global superpower, the USSR needed global reach. He commissioned powerful new cruisers, nuclear submarines, and even the first Soviet aircraft carriers. Yet, even under his ambitious leadership, the foundational philosophy remained deeply ingrained. The Soviet Navy was built for sea denial. Its purpose was to deny the use of the seas to its enemies, primarily the United States Navy and its NATO allies. It was a defensive and reactive strategy. The goal was to make the oceans so dangerous that American fleets would be unable to approach the Soviet Union or its allies. This strategy relied on a critical assumption that the enemy was just like them, shackled by the laws of logistics. Soviet war games and strategic plans were built around the concept of the logistical tail. They calculated, with grim precision, how many days an American carrier group could operate at high intensity before its fuel bunkers ran dry, its ammunition magazines were empty, and its sailors were exhausted. Their network of tattletales, spy ships, submarines, and long-range reconnaissance aircraft, like Alexei Voronov's Bear, was designed specifically to monitor this logistical state. The plan was to wait for the American fleet to reach its point of exhaustion, its logistical culmination, and then strike with overwhelming force using swarms of missile-armed bombers and submarines. It was a strategy of patience, of attrition, of waiting for the giant to tire itself out. The Soviet system itself reinforced this thinking. The command economy, while effective at producing massive quantities of standardized military hardware like tanks and rifles, was notoriously inefficient and inflexible. Building a global network of support bases on the scale of the United States was economically and politically impossible for the Soviet Union. Their few overseas client states offered limited, often unreliable basing options. The idea of creating a vast, floating logistical fleet of specialized, complex ships to service the Navy in mid-ocean was a fantasy. It would require a level of economic dynamism and industrial flexibility that their system simply did not possess. So, they built what they knew, powerful warships designed to fight close to home. Their navy was a formidable force, a steel fist. But it was a fist attached to a very short arm. On the other side of the world, the American naval philosophy was born from a completely different historical experience. The United States was a maritime nation, separated from the world's conflicts by two vast oceans. For the US Navy, distance was not a constraint. It was the primary operational reality. The Second World War in the Pacific was the ultimate proving ground. It was a war fought across thousands of miles of empty ocean, a war of island hopping and carrier battles, where the ability to sustain forces far from home was not just an advantage, it was the absolute prerequisite for victory. The campaigns against Japan were, at their core, a war of logistics. Out of this experience, the US Navy developed a revolutionary concept, the Mobile Logistics Support Force. They learned the hard way that fleets chained to fixed, vulnerable island bases were fleets waiting to be destroyed. The solution was to create a fleet train, a convoy of support ships that could carry the base with the fleet. Early experiments during the war, using converted tankers and merchant ships, were clumsy but effective. They proved the concept worked. In the post-war era, this concept was refined and perfected into an art form. The United States, with its globe-spanning interests and commitments, needed a navy that could fight anywhere, anytime, indefinitely. The problem was immense. A modern carrier battle group is a voracious consumer. A single carrier could burn over 500,000 gallons of fuel per day. Its air wing required hundreds of tons of bombs, missiles, and jet fuel. Its crew of over 5,000 sailors needed food, fresh water, and supplies. Supporting an entire fleet of a dozen or more ships was a monumental task. The American solution was not a single invention, but a system of innovations. They designed and built specialized ships for every conceivable logistical need. Fleet oilers, AOs, carrying millions of gallons of fuel, ammunition ships, AEs, with climate-controlled holds for sensitive ordnance, and combat stores, ships, AFS, that were essentially floating supermarkets. The innovation didn't stop with the ships. It was the method of transfer that was truly revolutionary. The process Alexei Voronov witnessed was the culmination of decades of refinement. It was called underway replenishment, or UNREP. The technique of connected replenishment, CONREP, involved sending high-strength steel wires between ships. Using a system of tensioned lines called the standard tensioned replenishment alongside method, STREAM, crews could move fuel hoses and pallets of cargo weighing several tons from the supply ship to the combatant ship, all while both vessels steamed ahead at speed. Simultaneously, the development of powerful helicopters in the 1960s led to vertical replenishment, VERTREP. Helicopters could lift cargo from the decks of supply ships and deliver it directly to any ship in the battle group, dramatically increasing the speed and flexibility of the operation. The pinnacle of this evolution was the fast combat support ship, the AOE class, like the USS Sacramento. These were not slow, lumbering support vessels. They were massive ships, over 700 feet long, capable of speeds over 26 knots, fast enough to keep pace with a carrier strike group. And they were the ultimate one-stop shop, carrying fuel, ammunition and stores all in one hull. They were the phantom that haunted Soviet dreams, the physical embodiment of a logistical system that made the US Navy a truly global, self-sustaining force. It was a weapon the Soviets had no answer for, because it wasn't a weapon at all. It was a system, a philosophy, an expression of national power that they could observe, they could fear, but they could never ever replicate. Back in the vibrating fuselage of the Tupolev Tu-95, silence had fallen. The only sounds were the drone of the four massive Kuznetsov turboprop engines and the rhythmic ping of their own surveillance radar. On the main tactical screen, the impossible ballet continued below. The USS Sacramento, a beast of a ship in her own right, was now simultaneously connected to the aircraft carrier USS John F. Kennedy on one side and the guided missile cruiser USS Biddle on the other. It was a three-ship dance of logistics, a maneuver of such breathtaking seamanship and coordination that it seemed to defy logic. Each ship ploughed through the waves, maintaining a constant distance of less than 200 feet, a separation that left zero room for error. A single miscalculation by any of the three helmsmen would result in a catastrophic collision. Yet, they moved as if they were one organism. For the crew of the Bear, this was more than a tactical problem. It was an intellectual and spiritual crisis. Senior Lieutenant Alexei Voronov, the navigator, found himself sketching the formation in his logbook, his mind racing to calculate the fuel transfer rates, the tonnage of ordnance moving across the high lines. The numbers were staggering. This single support ship was, in a matter of hours, restoring the entire battle group to full combat readiness. It was erasing days of hard steaming and intense flight operations from the ledger. The Soviet strategy of attrition, the patient waiting for the enemy to exhaust himself, was a fantasy. It was a doctrine built on a false premise. The American fleet was not a predator that needed to return to its lair to feed. It was a self-sustaining ecosystem, a creature that carried its hunting grounds, its nest, and its sustenance with it wherever it went. The commander of the Tu-95, a man whose face was a permanent mask of stoic resolve, made a decision. His voice, gravelly from hours of breathing recycled air, cut through the silence on the intercom. "Bring us closer. I want high-resolution imagery of their transfer rigs. Central Command will not believe this without perfect proof." It was a direct violation of their standing orders. Closing the distance would be seen as a provocation. It meant crossing a line, both literally and figuratively. The American F-4 Phantoms, sitting armed and ready on the carrier's catapults, could be airborne in under 5 minutes. The Bear, with its immense wingspan and ponderous speed, would be a sitting duck, yet not a single crewman questioned the order. The need to understand, to document this terrifying new reality, outweighed the risk. As the bomber banked, descending slowly, the details below sharpened from abstract symbols on a screen into a visceral reality. They could see the individual sailors on the decks, clad in color-coded vests, moving with a practiced, almost casual efficiency. Yellow-shirted directors guided the flow of cargo. Blue-vested riggers handled the lines. Purple-shirted sailors, the grapes, managed the fuel hoses. It wasn't the frantic, high-stress activity of a combat operation. It was the methodical, disciplined work of a well-oiled machine. It was routine. This was the most chilling realization of all. For the Americans, this impossibly complex and dangerous maneuver was just another Tuesday. Inside the dimly lit Combat Information Center, or CIC, of the USS John F. Kennedy, the atmosphere was the complete opposite of the tense Soviet cockpit. Here, the air was cool and smelled of coffee. A young radarman, barely out of his teens, leaned toward his officer. "Sir, the bear is descending. Looks like he's coming in for a closer look. Range now 80 kilometers." The tactical action officer, a seasoned lieutenant commander, took a slow sip from his mug without looking away from the main plot. He'd seen this dozens of times. "He's feeling brave today," he noted with a wry smile. "Inform the admiral on the bridge, and have the air boss put the Alert 5 crew on standby." On the carrier's bridge, the admiral glanced at the report. Below him, on the flight deck, 2 F-4 Duels Phantoms sat poised on the waste catapults, their engines silent, their canopies gleaming. They were the Alert 5, the designated interceptors whose crews could go from a ready-room card game to being launched off the deck in 5 minutes flat. The admiral watched the distant silver speck of the Soviet bomber through a set of powerful mounted binoculars. He saw no menace, only predictability. The Soviets were diligent record keepers. A new American capability on display would naturally require a closer look for their files back in Moscow. "Let them get a little closer," the admiral said to his captain. "Let them get a good look. It's good for them to see how we do business out here. If he crosses the 50-mile line, launch the Phantoms. No hostile intent. Just escort him out of our bubble. Give their tail gunner a nice, friendly wave." The order was given with the casual authority of a man who held all the cards. There was no alarm, no sense of threat. The bear was a known quantity, a slow, predictable part of the game. The true power wasn't in the Phantoms waiting on the deck. It was in the seamless, unstoppable replenishment happening just a few hundred feet away. That was the real checkmate. The radio in Alexei's headphones crackled. It was a high-frequency transmission from one of the Soviet tattletale spy trawlers that was shadowing the fleet from a greater distance. "Vigilant 7, we are painting 2 new contacts lifting off the carrier deck, high-speed intercept course." The confirmation came a moment later from their own electronic warfare officer. The Americans had scrambled their fighters. The commander of the bear showed no emotion. "Hold course," he ordered. "Let them come. The camera crews are not finished." The gamble was that the Americans would not fire the first shot in international airspace. It was a test of nerve, a classic Cold War probe. Minutes later, the Phantoms appeared. They didn't approach with the aggressive, nose-on posture of an attack run. Instead, they materialized as if from nowhere, sliding into a perfect, tight formation on either wing of the massive bomber. They were so close that Alexei could see the faces of the American pilots through their visors. The pilot in the lead Phantom gave a slow, deliberate salute. It was not a gesture of respect. It was a gesture of ownership. It was the calm, confident signal of a landlord reminding a trespasser whose property they were on. The American fighter was a hornet to their lumbering bear, sleek, powerful, and deadly. Its wings were heavy with Sparrow and Sidewinder missiles, a stark reminder of the violence it could unleash in seconds. And in that moment, the full weight of their humiliation crashed down upon the Soviet crew. They were not warriors engaged in a tense standoff. They were spectators who had been allowed a front-row seat to a demonstration of their own irrelevance. The Americans were not just refueling their fleet, they were doing it while casually swatting away the best long-range reconnaissance platform the Soviet Union could field. The act of replenishment was a statement of endurance. The effortless interception was a statement of dominance. Together, they formed a message of contempt. The message was clear: we can stay here as long as we want, we can go wherever we want, and there is absolutely nothing you can do about it. The F-4 pilot, having made his point, banked his aircraft away, gesturing for the Tu-95 to turn back. There was no need for threats over the radio. The visual language of power was absolute. With a heavy heart, the Soviet commander gave the order to turn for home. They had their pictures, their proof, but they had also received a lesson in sea power that no one in the Soviet Admiralty would ever forget. The long flight back to the Kola Peninsula was a somber, silent journey into the shadow of a new reality. The file landed with a soft but heavy thud on the polished wood desk of a rear admiral in Severomorsk, the heavily fortified headquarters of the Soviet Northern Fleet. The report from Senior Lieutenant Voronov's reconnaissance flight was filed under Unusual Capabilities, USS Brackett, Navy Logistics. It was filled with grainy photographs, meticulous drawings of the American replenishment rigs, and pages of cold, hard analysis. The Admiral read it, then read it again. His initial reaction was one of professional skepticism. Such a maneuver, conducted at speed in the open ocean, seemed to court disaster. It spoke of a level of seamanship and equipment that bordered on reckless, but the evidence was undeniable. Within months, it became clear that the report from the Norwegian Sea was not an outlier, it was the new baseline. From the Pacific Fleet, shadowing American carriers in the Sea of Japan, came similar reports. From the Black Sea Fleet's deployments into the Mediterranean, the same story emerged. A pattern, terrifying in its consistency, was being documented by the eyes of the Soviet Navy across the globe. The Americans had operationalized the impossible. Their fleets were no longer tied to land. They had severed the logistical leash that had constrained naval power since the age of sail. This wasn't a clever trick or a one-time capability. It was a system woven into the very fabric of their naval doctrine. The United States Navy hadn't just built a few supply ships. They had created a global, mobile, and relentless logistics machine. They had fleets of specialized vessels, fast fleet oilers, ammunition ships whose cavernous holds were packed with enough ordnance to level a small country, and refrigerated stores ships carrying everything from engine parts to fresh vegetables. These vessels were not just auxiliaries, they were integral components of combat power. They were organized into dedicated mobile logistics support groups, whose sole purpose was to follow the fleet, to anticipate its needs, and to replenish it on demand, anywhere in the world. For Soviet naval intelligence, trying to map this new reality was like trying to map the movements of a ghost. How could you predict an enemy's operational limits when he had none? The most brutal and sustained demonstration of this system came in the humid, tropical waters of the South China Sea. On a patch of ocean designated Yankee Station, the U.S. Navy maintained a continuous, multi-carrier presence for years on end during the Vietnam War. For the ever-present Soviet intelligence trawlers, the small rusty ships bristling with antennas that shadowed the American fleets, Yankee Station was a classroom in futility. Day after day, the Soviet crews would watch the thunderous spectacle. F-4 Phantoms and A-7 Corsairs, heavy with bombs, would be shot from the catapults of the USS Kitty Hawk or the USS Constellation, screaming into the sky toward targets over North Vietnam. Hours later, they would return, lightened of their deadly cargo, to be deftly caught by the arresting wires on deck. The cycle was endless, a production line of aerial destruction operating 24 hours a day. The captain of one such trawler, a veteran of Murmansk convoys in the Great Patriotic War, would stand on his bridge, counting the sorties. He knew, with the ingrained knowledge of a lifelong mariner, what this kind of operational tempo cost. The fuel consumption was astronomical. The expenditure of munitions was unsustainable. Every law of naval warfare dictated that the American carrier must soon withdraw. It would have to stand down, break off combat operations, and begin the long, vulnerable transit to their bases at Subic Bay in the Philippines or Yokosuka in Japan. That was when the shadowing Soviet submarine would have its chance. That was when the fleet was weakest, but the day of withdrawal never came. Instead, on the horizon, the silhouettes of the supply ships would appear. The combat operations would not even pause. While one carrier launched its morning strike package, another would be sliding alongside the USS Sacramento or the USS Detroit. The Soviet captain would watch through his binoculars, a knot of cold fury and professional envy tightening in his stomach. He would see the steel wires spanning the waves, the pallets of bombs and missiles gliding across the gap, the thick fuel hoses pumping the lifeblood of war into the carrier's veins. He was witnessing the rearming of an arsenal and the refueling of a fortress in the middle of a war zone. The Americans weren't just fighting a war. They were doing it on their own terms, completely untethered from the constraints of geography. The relentless rhythm of the catapults never faltered. For the Soviets watching from the rail of their shabby little spy ship, the message was profound. The Americans weren't visiting this ocean. They owned it. This systematic dominance was thrown into even sharper relief during the tense days of the 1973 Yom Kippur War. When Egypt and Syria attacked Israel, the superpowers were pushed to the brink of confrontation. The Soviet Union poured arms into the Arab states, while the United States launched a massive airlift to resupply a desperate Israel. In the Mediterranean, the Soviet 5th Escadra, a powerful squadron of cruisers, destroyers and submarines, surged to challenge the US 6th Fleet. It was the most dangerous naval standoff since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Aboard the flagship of the Soviet squadron, a Kinder-class missile cruiser, the Soviet admiral felt he had the upper hand. His ships were modern and bristling with long-range anti-ship missiles. More importantly, geography was on his side. The American Sixth Fleet was in a precarious position. Fearing entanglement in the conflict, many of America's European allies denied basing rights for the resupply effort. The ports of the Mediterranean were closing to them. The Soviet admiral knew that the American fleet, operating at peak readiness, was burning fuel and consuming supplies at a ferocious rate. He calculated he only had to wait. Sooner or later, the Americans would have to reduce their presence, to send ships away to refuel. That would be the moment of opportunity. He was wrong. The lifeline for the Sixth Fleet did not come from ports in Italy or Spain. It came from the west, steaming out of the Atlantic. It was Task Group 60.3, the Sixth Fleet's permanent underway replenishment group. Like a phantom convoy, the fleet oilers and ammunition ships appeared, escorted by their own destroyers. In the tense waters of the Ionian Sea, under the constant surveillance of Soviet aircraft, the American replenishment ships met the fleet. The Soviet admiral had to watch from his own bridge as the American carrier, the USS Franklin D. Roosevelt, and its escorts were refueled and reprovisioned right in the middle of the standoff. His geographical advantage had been rendered meaningless. The Americans didn't need European ports, they had brought their port with them. It was a stunning demonstration of strategic independence, a capability that allowed the United States to project power and sustain its allies, even when its friends abandoned it. Out of these repeated frustrating encounters, a single, powerful symbol of American dominance became seared into the consciousness of the Soviet Navy. It was not a weapon, it was not a ship. It was an act, the act of underway replenishment itself. The image of 2 or even 3 massive ships ploughing through the sea, connected by a web of wires and hoses, became a haunting motif. In grainy reconnaissance photos and shaky intelligence films shown in the briefing rooms of Severomorsk and Vladivostok, this steel umbilical cord was a recurring sight. It looked unnatural, a defiance of the sea's fury. It was a spectacle of immense power, but also of immense trust and skill trust between captains, skill among the crews. This symbol represented something far more profound than mere logistical superiority. It represented a different philosophy of command, of empowerment, to the rigid top-down Soviet system, where initiative was often punished, and every action required approval from a distant, centralized authority. The fluid coordination and delegated responsibility required for an UNREP seemed almost alien. It was a symbol of the American system's flexibility, its emphasis on training, and its trust in the men on the scene. The sight of the ships lashed together in their ghostly dance became a psychological weapon. It was a constant, nagging reminder that the enemy they faced was not just richer and bigger, but fundamentally more adaptable. How could they hope to defeat a navy that could fight a war for months on end without ever touching land? The steel umbilical became a symbol of their own strategic confinement, proof that while Soviet ships could venture onto the blue water, the world's oceans truly belonged to the United States Navy. The shockwave from the discovery of America's underway replenishment capability did not stop at the edges of the fleet. It traveled up the chain of command, through secure cables and encrypted diplomatic bags, until it reached the cavernous, wood-paneled offices of the Ministry of Defense in Moscow. Here, the grainy photos of the USS Sacramento refueling a carrier at speed were not just a tactical curiosity, they were a strategic nightmare. Admiral Sergei Gorshkov, the powerful and ambitious father of the modern Soviet Navy, saw the implications with terrifying clarity. His entire strategy for challenging the West at sea was predicated on a single, fundamental weakness of his adversary, the logistical leash. He had built a navy of assassins, submarines and cruisers, armed with monstrous anti-ship missiles designed to ambush and kill American carrier groups as they became predictable, forced to steam along established sea lanes toward their bases and supply depots. But the American UNREP system had cut that leash. The enemy was no longer predictable. A carrier group could disappear into the vastness of the Atlantic or Pacific, operate at high intensity for weeks, and then, without warning, be fully restored to combat power by a phantom fleet of support ships. It rendered Gorshkov's waiting assassins blind and impotent. For the Politburo, the political leadership of the Soviet Union, the threat was even more existential. A US Navy that could remain on station indefinitely, anywhere in the world, could impose a global blockade on the USSR and its allies. It could project power onto their shores, support proxy wars, and intervene in crises without ever needing a friendly port. It was a tool of global dominance that threatened to permanently trap the Soviet Union as a mere continental power. The realization was stark. The logistics gap was not a minor inconvenience, it was a checkmate on their global ambitions. The Soviet response was characteristic of their entire military-industrial philosophy. They did not and could not attempt to replicate the American system. Building a vast, flexible, and efficient logistics fleet required a dynamic economy and a naval culture of delegated authority that they simply did not possess. Their system was built for mass production of brute force weapons, not for intricate, service-oriented support networks. So, they doubled down on what they knew best. Their solution was not to out-sustain the Americans, but to annihilate them in a single, overwhelming blow. If they could not starve the beast, they would have to kill it in its lair. This was their big bet, the perfection of the massed anti-ship missile saturation attack. The concept was terrifyingly simple. The Soviet High Command reasoned that while an American carrier battle group's defenses were formidable, they were not infinite. The Aegis combat system, with its powerful radars and standard missiles, could track and engage dozens of targets. But could it engage hundreds arriving simultaneously from different altitudes and directions? The Soviets bet it could not. The plan was to coordinate a massive, synchronized strike from submerged submarines, surface cruisers, and long-range bombers. They would launch a tidal wave of supersonic anti-ship missiles, weapons like the P-500 Basalt and the even more formidable P-700 Granite, enormous missiles the size of small fighter jets, each carrying a massive conventional or nuclear warhead. The goal was to create a picture of such apocalyptic chaos on the American radar screens that the system would be overwhelmed, allowing a handful of leakers to get through and strike the carrier, the heart of the fleet. To execute this plan, they built the most fearsome naval platforms the world had ever seen. They commissioned the Oscar-class nuclear-powered submarines, gargantuan underwater arsenals designed to carry 24 Granite missiles. They built the Kirov-class nuclear-powered battlecruisers, the largest surface combatants other than aircraft carriers, armed with 20 Granite missiles of their own. And they deployed entire regiments of Tu-22M backfire supersonic bombers, each capable of carrying multiple, smaller, but still deadly air-launched anti-ship missiles. This was the Soviet Fist, a collection of ironclad sluggers designed for a single, knockout punch. The cost was astronomical, consuming a vast portion of the Soviet defense budget for 2 decades. It was an all-or-nothing gamble on a single tactical theory. But this grand, brutalist strategy had a fatal flaw, an Achilles heel of immense proportions: targeting. To launch a missile swarm at a carrier group 500 kilometers away, you needed to know precisely where that carrier was at the exact moment of launch. A carrier battle group is a moving target, often steaming at over 30 knots. A position that is 30 minutes old is useless. The entire viability of the saturation attack doctrine rested on a single critical capability: real-time, over-the-horizon targeting. The Soviet solution to this problem was as ambitious as it was ultimately flawed: a space-based reconnaissance system called Legenda. It was a network of satellites designed to do one thing: find American fleets. The system consisted of 2 types of satellites working in pairs. The first was the EORSAT, Electronic Ocean Reconnaissance Satellite, a passive satellite that would listen for the electronic emissions, the radar, the radio chatter of the American fleet. The second, and more revolutionary component, was the RORSAT, Radar Ocean Reconnaissance Satellite. This was a satellite equipped with a powerful radar that could actively scan the ocean's surface from space, detecting the ships themselves. Because such a powerful radar required an immense amount of energy, the RORSATs were powered by their own onboard nuclear reactors. On paper, it was a visionary solution. In reality, it was a technological catastrophe. The satellites were incredibly complex, fantastically expensive, and notoriously unreliable. Their operational lifespans were measured in months, sometimes only weeks. The nuclear-powered RORSATs were a constant source of international anxiety. The failure of Cosmos 950, 4 inches 1978, which scattered radioactive debris across a vast swath of northern Canada, exposed the terrifying risks of the program. But the most critical failure was a systemic one. The Legenda system provided snapshots, not a continuous stream of data. The information had to be received by a ground station, processed, analyzed, and then relayed to the submarines and ships waiting for the order to fire. This entire cycle could take precious hours, by which time the American fleet was long gone from its last known position. The real-time targeting system was never truly real-time. Here, then, is the killer statistic that encapsulates the failure of the Soviets' grand countermeasure. The Soviet Union committed a budget, rivaling its nuclear weapons program, to build this system of space-based targeting and the missile platforms it was meant to guide. Yet for most of the Cold War, they struggled to keep more than a single pair of functional agenda satellites in orbit at any one time. This single fragile web in space was their only reliable means of independently targeting the 15 American carrier battle groups that could be deployed across the globe. For the vast majority of the time, their multi-billion ruble fleet of carrier killers was effectively blind. The psychological toll of this reality within the Soviet Navy was immense and corrosive. They possessed the most powerful anti-ship missiles ever built, manned colossal submarines and cruisers, and trained relentlessly for the decisive battle. Yet they knew that their entire strategy rested on a fragile, often broken chain of technology. They lived in a state of constant strategic anxiety, knowing that the American fleets, by contrast, were self-contained ecosystems of power. While Soviet admirals prayed for a functioning satellite pass to grant them a single fleeting glimpse of their enemy, the American admiral had his own E-2 Hawkeye aircraft circling overhead, providing a perfect, real-time picture of the entire battlespace, all while his fleet was being refueled and rearmed by its ever-present support ships. It was the ultimate asymmetry. The Soviets had built a spectacular but brittle weapon. The Americans had built a mundane but unbreakable system. One was designed for a single, desperate roll of the dice. The other was designed to own the table. The failure of the Legenda satellite system and the inherent blindness of the Soviet carrier-killer fleets was not merely a technical shortcoming. It was a symptom of a much deeper, more profound institutional disease. It was the logical endpoint of a system that had mistaken imitation for innovation and brute force for genuine strength. The inability to target an American fleet in real time was a direct reflection of the Soviet command economy's inability to adapt, create, and sustain complex dynamic systems in the real world. The core of the issue lay in a fundamental ideological divide. The American system, for all its flaws, was a decentralized ecosystem. The innovation that led to the underway replenishment fleet was not the result of a single 5-year plan decreed from the Pentagon. It evolved organically, born from the brutal necessities of the Pacific War and refined over decades by thousands of individuals, engineers, naval architects, logisticians, and sailors on deck, all contributing to a constantly improving process. It was a system that trusted its people. It gave a 20-year-old helmsman the responsibility to keep a billion-dollar warship 150 feet from a supply ship in heavy seas. It gave a lieutenant commander the authority to orchestrate a complex ballet of helicopters and highlines without constant oversight from an admiral miles away. This culture of empowerment, of decentralized problem-solving, was the secret ingredient that made the logistical miracle possible. It was a direct product of a society that, at its core, valued individual initiative and freedom. The Soviet system was the philosophical opposite. It was a rigid, top-down hierarchy pathologically afraid of individual initiative. Power and information were hoarded at the center, in Moscow. The command economy was a marvel of brute force production. If the state decreed that 10,000 tanks were needed, the factories would produce 10,000 tanks. This method was effective for creating massive quantities of standardized, relatively simple hardware. But it was utterly incapable of creating something as intricate and fluid as a mobile logistics force. An UNREP system isn't a piece of hardware you can reverse engineer like a captured bomber. It's a living network of specialized ships, global supply depots, complex inventory management, and, most importantly, a culture of highly trained, trusted, and empowered personnel. The Soviet system, which often punished initiative and rewarded rigid adherence to doctrine, could never foster such a culture. It could build the world's biggest submarine, the most powerful missile, the fastest interceptor. But it could not build the trust required to sail 3 ships abreast at 20 knots while passing bombs and fuel between them. So instead, they built what they understood: the knockout punch. The Oscar-class submarines and the Kirov-class battlecruisers were the ultimate expression of this philosophy. They were magnificent feats of engineering, breathtaking in their scale and menace. They were designed to solve a complex strategic problem, the dominance of the American carrier, with a single, overwhelming application of force. But this entire edifice of power rested on the fragile foundation of the Legenda targeting system, a complex, centralized solution that proved too brittle to work. The Americans, in contrast, solved their strategic problem, the tyranny of distance, not with a single weapon, but with a resilient, decentralized, and decidedly unglamorous system. The Soviets built a spectacular sword, the Americans built an unbreakable shield and a limitless supply of arrows. The verdict of this contest of systems was not rendered in a fiery naval battle in the North Atlantic. It came quietly, with the groan of rusting steel and the decay of a superpower's treasury. The massive investment in the carrier-killer navy was a Pyrrhic victory. The ships were built, but they were so expensive to operate and so dependent on a flawed support system that they spent most of their service lives tied to their piers, slowly corroding in the harsh northern ports of the Kola Peninsula. They were a fleet in being that could barely go to sea. The economic strain of trying to keep pace with an adversary who had mastered the art of sustainable power projection helped to hollow out the Soviet economy from the inside. Every ruble spent on a P-700 Granite missile that could not be accurately targeted was a ruble not spent on bread for the stores in Minsk or medicine for the hospitals in Sverdlovsk. The ultimate demonstration of this systemic failure came not on the high seas, but in the heart of a divided city. November 9th, 1989, the Berlin Wall. For decades, it had been the most potent symbol of the Cold War's Iron Division. It was a physical manifestation of the Soviet system's core nature, a fortress designed to keep people in, not to project power out. When it fell, it wasn't breached by an army or shattered by a bomb. It was rendered irrelevant by a torrent of ordinary people who had simply had enough of the lies and the scarcity. The guards stood aside because the system they served had lost its will, its purpose, and its money. The collapse of the Berlin Wall was a logistical failure on a historic scale. It was proof that a system built on coercion and centralized control, no matter how powerful it appears on the outside, cannot sustain itself. It will eventually rust from within. The fate of the Soviet Navy was a perfect mirror of the fate of the Soviet state. The American system, with its boring, methodical, and relentless logistical power, never had to fire a shot at the great Soviet battlecruisers. It simply outlasted them. It demonstrated a form of power so complete and sustainable that it exhausted its rival into bankruptcy and collapse. The unglamorous fleet oiler, the humble combat stores ship, the crews who perfected the dangerous dance of underway replenishment, they were the true victors of the Cold War at sea. In the end, the story of naval logistics in the Cold War offers a profound and enduring lesson on the nature of global power. It is a story that began with a Soviet navigator staring in disbelief at an impossible sight on a grey northern sea. It is the story of two competing ideologies, each expressing itself through the fleets it built. One built a navy of magnificent but brittle weapons, designed for a single, decisive moment that never came. The other built a navy that could be everywhere, always, sustained by a floating umbilical cord of fuel, bombs, and bread that stretched across the globe. The true measure of a superpower is not the size of its explosions, but the length of its reach and the depth of its endurance. The Soviet Union built a fist, the United States built an arm, and in the long, grinding struggle of the Cold War, it was the nation with the longer reach that inherited the world's oceans, and with them, the verdict of history.